Hello and welcome to episode 163 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. Hello, Ian. How are you?
Hello, Jason. I'm doing all right. I'm muddling my way through the week. We've been dealing with quarantines and things. Thankfully, no one in our house is sick, but some people got sick in the youngsters' classroom, and so they've been in quarantine at the beginning of the week. So that's been fun because, of course, this is the week where both my wife and I have multiple engagements with people outside of our own offices and therefore have to appear to be professional. So that's been a wonderful challenge to get around, but everyone is healthy, so small mercies.
That's good.
How are you?
I'm good. You and I have had very different weeks so far.
We have. I'm not jealous at all. I'm not at all.
Jealous. Are you sure?
Not at all.
Are you sure? I feel a bit of insincerity.
A twinge of jealousy.
Yeah, it doesn't sound accurate to me.
So what did you do this week?
I left on Sunday and returned to New York today, but I was in St. Martin, of all places, for the past few days.
And how was Plane Spotter's Paradise?
It was everything it's supposed to be.
Excellent.
I have not been there since, I think, 2016. I've been there twice before, 2014 and I think 2016. Not since the hurricane that absolutely obliterated pretty much everything on the island.
Yeah.
But they're still building back. I stayed at the Ocean Point, which is, I think, a Cessna property, which is right by Maho Beach. I didn't arrange it or anything, but the room had a balcony that happened to look over the bay where the aircraft fly over and had a great view of the entire runway. Just worked out that way, and it was nice.
I'm not jealous. I'm treating this as a reconnaissance mission on my behalf. You went down there, you checked things out, you made sure that they're rebuilding nicely. So when I eventually make it down there, I'm going to know what to do and where to go. And so I appreciate your efforts. That's how I'm spinning this in my direction.
It was excellent. Not quite the same as the last couple times I was down there, since the aviation industry has changed quite a bit since then. It's also fringe off-peak season, so there's a bit less arrivals every day there, but gone are the days of the KLM 747 and the Air France June rooftop bar A340. That's gone. So the biggest aircraft I saw was actually a KLM A330-300, which was nice. It wasn't a 200, but that was the largest aircraft I saw while I was there, which is nice, but it's gone are the days.
You missed the Queen. You missed the Queen.
Gone are the days of jumbo jet at St. Martin and realistically most other places.
Yeah. I'm glad you had fun, and I do appreciate you taking one for the team and going down there to check things out for us.
Yeah, I do what I can. I'm happy to report back. So lots of good aircraft. Let's see, who did I see? A couple airlines I didn't even know existed. There was I think a Dominican airline, maybe it was Dominican Jet Air, operated with a Fokker F-70, which is pretty fantastic. I haven't seen one of those in very long time, and I think we discussed that pretty much the only other ones operating are in Australia at this point.
Yeah, I mean to get a hold of one, you have to pretty much go to if you want to have a realistic chance. If most people want to have a realistic chance, you're going to need to head to Australia.
Yeah. And I think there was an Air Caribbe's A330, which was a nice thing to see. Only came in once during the time I was down there. Everything else was pretty much an American 737, JetBlue, A320, United 737. That was really the bulk of it. The one aircraft I did see, almost didn't see, because it came in on my last day there and diverted back to Jamaica after departing bound for St. Martin, but Caribbean Airlines 737-800, I think the registration is 9YTAB. I was told that was actually its final day of commercial operations for that particular aircraft. So that was nice that I was able to catch that.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's always nice when you can accidentally catch a little bit of history. I like
Yeah.
that.
Don't know if it's going to be retired, broken up, or have a nice hole cut in the side and converted into a freighter, which I'm assuming is its fate. But I
Probably.
guess we'll
Yeah.
see. Yeah, I'm sure it'll be coming to an Amazon hub airport near you soon.
Yeah, likely. It is Wednesday, the 11th of May, and we're recording a little bit later today. Because of that, it seems that breaking news has occurred before we began recording. It's so fresh, we don't really know exactly what happened. But a Tibet Airlines A319 suffered some sort of fire runway excursion in Chongqing. On departure, we're still seeing if we can pull any more data than the initial pass that we have, which wasn't much beyond a taxi out. Still breaking news, just coming out, but we're looking into it, and we'll have a little bit more on next week's show. I just want to point out that this occurred before we started recording for once, so I can only imagine what's going to happen after we stop recording.
Yes,
but
well,
we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Yes, there is a new tweet coming out of China of 53 seconds ago that says there were 113 passengers on board, no fatalities, several minor injuries, which is obviously always great to hear. This is very preliminary information, but any sort of preliminary information of that nature is welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. It looked like a number of people were safely evacuating the aircraft in the videos that made it onto social media so far. So hopefully we continue to see the reports that only minor injuries. I'm moving on to what I thought we would lead the show with this week, because normally without that breaking news, this would lead this episode and probably nearly any other episode.
You can't really top this story.
So I'm just going to quote the guy directly. This is a passenger on a Cessna 208 Caravan that's flying from Marsh Harbor to Fort Pierce in Florida, getting a hold of air traffic control and saying, quote, "I've got a serious situation here. My pilot has gone incoherent. I have no idea how to fly the airplane."
That's one thing stands out is that for someone who has no experience flying an aircraft whatsoever, simply figuring out how to key the mic to transmit that message, that's an accomplishment in and of itself, I think.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully as part of this, they received some sort of safety briefing and they were talking to the pilot beforehand. But usually that safety briefing doesn't include, here's how to fly the plane in case I can't anymore. The passenger got a hold of air traffic control. Air traffic control said, "Hey, where are you?" The guy says, "I have no idea." And then they figured out where he was. They talked him down, and he successfully landed this Cessna Caravan at Palm Beach on the runway. And the video shows it. That's a great landing.
Yeah. And this comes, the FAA says, after the pilot flying initially became sick and fell, what they say, against the controls, putting the aircraft into a nosedive and sharp turn. So not only did the passenger successfully land the aircraft quite well on top of that, but he actually recovered the aircraft out of a nosedive and sharp turn to then figure out how to communicate with ATC and then land the aircraft. And the landing was so good that when air traffic control was talking to an American, I think it was an Airbus aircraft that had to delay its departure or maybe arrival because of this, they kind of did a double take when they were having their conversation, saying like, ATC said, hold for that Cessna, passengers just landed the plane. And they said, okay, we'll hold here. And then a couple seconds later, the pilot from the American flight go, wait, did you say the pilot landed the airplane? So yeah,
that was the passenger.
Yeah, or the passenger landed the airplane. Yeah. Sorry, it was such a good landing that even the commercial pilots of that American aircraft didn't think anything of it.
So they were cruising along at 9,825 feet, and they're approaching the Florida coast. And all of a sudden, they did a 90-degree turn, but they did a 90-degree turn the long way. So what is that? 270. Yeah. So they go from 9,825 feet. Max vertical speed is negative 11,584 feet in the 180, and then he pulls it up. So this is assuming where the passenger gains control of the aircraft, climbing back at 9,280 feet. All happens very quickly. So pilot slams forward on the controls. Passenger, I guess, yanks him off the controls and pulls it back up. And so they make it back up to about 9,200 feet. And at this point, they're talking between the air traffic controllers and this passenger who is now the pilot, and he manages to kind of bring it over the coast, figure it out, and then lines it up with the runway and lands. I mean, this is crazy.
There are a couple circumstances here that aided the miraculous landing, and that when the passengers got in touch with air traffic control, they ended up getting a phone number. They had a working cell phone and coverage, and they were able to call air traffic control, I think in West Palm Beach, and who they ended up talking to, one of the FAA controllers, happened to be a certified flight instructor with experience on Cessna aircraft, which happens to be extremely valuable information. And they were able to print out, I think, the instrument cluster and the controls for the Cessna and kind of walk the passengers through what they would need to do, whether that's flaps or I'm sure there was landing gear for this aircraft. I think it was a float plane, I think.
It had previously been a float plane, but those had been removed prior to this.
Okay. Because some of the pictures I saw had floats, some didn't. But they were able to very expertly guide this aircraft down to the ground. Just, again, one of those circumstances where everything lined up perfectly, including the aircraft on the center line of the runway.
And this all happened in 40 minutes.
Yeah.
The whole incident from pilot losing the ability to operate the aircraft to the passenger landing it, 40 minutes.
Pretty incredible. And also, these things happen. This is not the first time that FAA controllers have guided a passenger to land the aircraft. I remember several of instances of this in the not too distant past. But unfortunately, this is not one of those very, very new aircraft that have the one button push to auto land the aircraft.
Right there, the Garmin auto land.
Yeah, that would have been a really good use case for that. I don't think we've heard of an actual event of that happening just yet.
No, I don't think so.
Proof positive that such a thing is a very valuable button to be pressed. But in some cases, you don't need it.
I mean, if I'm this guy, here's obviously, if it's me, I'm like, okay, I can do this. I'm going to go get my pilot's license. If you're this guy, I don't know who this guy is. Does he say, I'm going to go get my pilot's license, or does he say, I'm done flying?
Yeah, I'm done flying. No, but
I landed it on my first try. I'm done.
He was cool under pressure. He says, we hear over the ATC chatter that he has no flying experience, but he clearly had his wits about him and some aviation knowledge. Yeah. He was able to call out, this is my descent rate. I think he said he read out the feet per minute of the descent or ascent. So he clearly had some of the terminology. He knew what squawk code was. They asked him for the ident button on the transponder. So there was, I think, a higher degree of knowledge and information than your typical airline passenger. But at the end of the day, someone who's never flown an aircraft, I don't think it matters how much they know about the controls, but actually doing
until
it.
You sit there and do it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, more power to them. An amazing job. We'll put the link to the video and a link to the consolidated air traffic control recording in the show notes, because as with all of these recordings, there's, it takes place over 40 minutes and there's only so much radio contact, especially because they were communicating over cell phones, where that was a big help to them landing. Speaking of pilot training, this is a very interesting update and renewed possibility for changing how things work in becoming a pilot in the US, as well as addressing the overall pilot shortage that is not only happening in the US, but is also happening around the world. This is a US specific one, but it remains to be seen if something like this could work elsewhere. I'm referring to Republic Airways' petition to the FAA to reduce the number of hours required by pilots that attend their program to receive their restricted air transport pilot certificate. So normally that requires 1,500 hours of flight time. They're saying that their classes, training, etc., is rigorous enough that it puts them on par with military aviators and thus only should require 750 hours of flight time. This would allow them to reduce the pressure on hiring qualified pilots, they say, because their pilots are coming through this program and are just as knowledgeable as military aviators, and thus don't need as many flight hours to have the same level of knowledge and experience that other pilots do as far as the 1,500 hour thing goes. I think this is a really interesting move, and it seems to be that they're doing all they can to make this case. I mean, this was a really well thought out proposal, I thought. I'm not sure it goes anywhere, but they did their homework.
Yeah. And this comes in response to the 1,500 hour rule, which was, I believe, put in place after the Colgan Air crash in Buffalo, where the Dash 8 was on approach to Buffalo, and the pilots just didn't really seem to know what they were doing, or they were just fatigued to the point where they couldn't figure out what they were doing. And now we have had this 1,500 hour rule for commercial pilots ever since. But it's a very interesting proposal. I really need to read up on it before I come up with a determination. But the reasoning sounds like it could be perfectly legitimate, right?
Yeah, no, I don't think they're off base here. See, this is what happens when you go on vacation. How dare you, sir?
I did not have a chance to read this very large briefing while I was
it's an in-depth article.
So,
or in-depth petition to the FAA from Republic. But so the big criticism from the 1,500 hour rule is, one, it's an arbitrary hour. I mean, all numbers essentially are arbitrary in determining how many hours are necessary and which hours are for these things and which hours count and things like that. So their argument is, well, if we're going to pick an arbitrary number, let's develop our program to meet the other arbitrary number, which is the 750 hour rule. And then they have, the ability to demonstrate that they are knowledgeable enough and skilled enough to meet this 750 hour rule instead of the 1,500 hour rule, because our program is so rigorous. I don't have the capability. I mean, this is a question certainly for the FAA. I don't have the capability to evaluate the rigorousness of their training program. But if it is in fact as rigorous as they say it is, this seems to make sense to me as an easy way. No, I wouldn't say easy way, but a sensible way to reduce the pressure on coming up with as many pilots. Obviously, this only helps Republic. So it's certainly not enough. And one of the things, and I'm moderating a conference this week, which will be over by the time the podcast comes out. So we'll put a link to the show notes if anybody's interested in that. But one of the people that was talking was Steve Ehrlich, who is the chairperson of the Pilots Together charity in the UK. And that was formed during the pandemic to help raise funds, distribute funds, and provide assistance to pilots in the UK that were made redundant as part of kind of airlines' response to COVID. And one of the things he's talking about is, there's all of this money invested by pilots around the world, people who become pilots around the world, sometimes over $100,000, £100,000, where they're spending all of this money with the promised return that job, the pilot career, will allow them to to pay back that training expense, and then also have a sound career and a sound job prospect throughout their career. And we get to this point where we're dealing with people who are investing so much, and then we say, well, there's a pilot shortage. Well, there are a lot of things, and we could do an entire episode, and we should do an entire episode on the quote unquote pilot shortage, because there are a number of people who argue there's not a pilot shortage, there's a not paying pilots enough problem. And so, finding ways to make it easier for people who want to become pilots and ensure that they have skills and knowledge enough to safely operate the aircraft. If that can be done with fewer hours because the hours are more intensive and more helpful to that training, I'm all for it.
Yeah, and you had mentioned that this would only aid Republic in churning up more pilots, but presumably this would also help any other U.S.-based airline that has its own training program like United does these days. And I think JetBlue, maybe, I'm not quite sure. But presumably if this rule were changed, any airline with its own in-house pilot training certification program would benefit from this idea where you'd cut the number of hours in half.
Yeah, they could somehow apply to say our program is just as rigorous as this standard, and therefore we should have X number of hours for the certificate. I don't see a problem with that. Certainly there are people who do, and what's interesting enough is that the pushback has been from the FAA, which seems to be a problem for Republic's proposal, but also airline pilot unions have said that the 1,500-hour rule is important, and there's a reason that it's there, and therefore we should keep it. They've been light on details. The pilots unions, they've been light on details thus far. I think they're still getting into it, but the FAA hasn't really said much more. They've received the petition, so it'll be interesting to see what their response overall is.
Yeah, definitely one thing to keep an eye on.
Speaking of the FAA, this was an interesting bit of reportage from our good friend John Ostrower over at the Air Current, or I should say from Elan Head and John Ostrower, both of whom we've had on the program separately, but not since Elan Head has moved over to the Air Current. When we spoke with Elan Head, we talked about eVTOLs. She told us everything we needed to know at that time about what they were, where they were going, and one of the big things that we talked about, besides the start-uppy kind of vaporware nature of some of these companies, was the massive effort towards certification that was going to impact whether or not any of these companies ever got off the ground.
Yeah, a lot of certification timelines for eVTOL companies are about to need updating very quickly.
Yes. And so now the reporting that Elan was doing, culminating in the article last week, was that the FAA is overhauling certification rubric that eVTOLs will be certified under. The eVTOL manufacturers were under the assumption that they would be certified under the small airplane certification rules that took effect in 2017. The FAA is now saying that they're going to certify eVTOLs as powered lift aircraft, which are the certification framework for things like tilt rotor aircraft, like the Leonardo AW609, which is a more akin to, think of a commercial version of the Osprey or something like that, where they're not straightforward small airplanes, and that could pose a very real and very difficult problem for these eVTOL manufacturers.
Yeah, especially this late in the game where there are several of these aircraft out there in flight testing, presumably in the certification process right now. Suddenly what they were aiming for certification is going to be completely turned on its head seemingly overnight. More venture capital is probably going to have to be raised for some of these companies, or they're just going to go. I assume they're going to go bankrupt just trying to get these things certified. I don't think that's a terribly bad thing, honestly. These seem to be progressing way too quickly at this point, but yet another instance of the FAA really, really taking a close look at how it certifies things. So this goes beyond Boeing at this point with the 787 and the 737 MAX. The FAA is really, really just taking a closer look at pretty much seemingly everything it does.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about pendulums, and certainly the pendulum is swinging far, far, far into the regulatory enforcement and structure side of things, and very, very far away from the management delegation and delegated authority and certify your own planes. We trust you. That's gone. It is very clear that all of that is just gone. And the FAA has decided that it is going to take a close look. You want to certify something that flies? Great. We're here to help. But these are the rules, and they are going to be very, very comprehensive, which I don't think is a bad thing at all. The abruptness with which this happened, that seems a little interesting to me. And that is something that I hope Alan continues to report on, because I think that's an interesting part of the puzzle here.
Yeah. Like you said, I think this is a good thing. There were a lot of these companies all pushing very aggressive timelines with some very, let's call them, interesting aircraft in a space that at this point does not exist. So any scrutiny they can put on these to really ensure that their safety, especially when we're talking about single pilot operation or possibly no pilot operation. I mean, just look at what we talked about earlier today.
Yeah.
Anything they can do to make sure these things are truly going to be safe is probably welcome at this point, as long as the FAA actually has the personnel and the skills needed to actually certify these aircraft, which at this point, I'm not totally sure they do.
That, sir, I feel like is another discussion for another episode.
Yes.
I feel like we need to have Alon on the show now.
Yeah, if it's taking this long just to recertify the 787, I can't imagine how they're going to go through certifying what seems like an endless stream of eVTOLs that pop up out of nowhere.
That's a good question, Jason.
With
that's
no answer.
Good question. Well, that's the kind of questions we like to ask on this podcast.
Someone will know. It's not me.
So here's a question. No, here's an answer to a question I don't think anyone asked. Brazil's GOL and Colombia's Avianca will join forces.
Avianca Colombia just recently out of bankruptcy and gobbled up. Who was it? We just talked about Viva. So second week in a row, we're talking about Avianca doing a thing.
We're moving through the clip. They will form Abra Group, so the open group, and it will be controlled by Avianca and GOL. And they will join forces, and the word synergy was used no fewer than 267 places in the press release here. Abra, which is styling itself as the Pan-Latin American Network of Airlines, will form a group, and all of these airlines will operate not independently, but operate separately.
Okay.
Under the group.
So they're the Lufthansa group of Latin America.
It seems to be that's what is happening. Okay.
So congratulations, South America. It seems like you're down to two airlines at this point, practically speaking. You've got the LATAM group and the Abra group.
Yeah, I mean, and then there's what Aerolíneas Argentinas, just kind of
They exist.
They exist. So this will be a very interesting thing. The one thing I want to do is note that Abra will also own a non-controlling, I'm quoting the press release here, a non-controlling 100% economic interest in Viva's operations in Colombia and Peru.
I understood the words, but not the meaning of those words. How do you have 100% ownership but not control of a thing.
I'm very, this is one of those things that I'm sure it makes financial and legal sense to people who are financial experts and lawyers. But as an airline person and an aviation person, this does not make any sense to me. So if you can explain how someone has a 100% economic interest that is non-controlling over something, by all means, email us at podcast@fr24.com and explain it to me, because I really want to know.
Yeah, we talked about this earlier in the day, and it makes no more sense now than it did 12 hours ago.
It certainly does not. This will, according to the airlines, provide synergies upon synergies upon synergies to ensure lower costs, expanded routes, serving a population of over 1 billion with a GDP of nearly $3 trillion. All that said, they didn't really explain how the synergies upon synergies will come about.
No, especially when you have
interesting to see
two independent airlines operating independently of each other. How does that work?
We shall see.
Okay.
We shall see. Let us switch continents and go across the Atlantic Ocean and a little bit north. And we were just mentioning the new Lufthansa group of South America. Let's talk about the actual Lufthansa group of Lufthansaville. The Lufthansa Group purchased further state-of-the-art long-haul aircraft this week, according to Lufthansa Group. They will take 700. They will take 7.
Wow, that's an expansion right there. It's like a Southwest order or something.
Yeah. Southwest and Ryanair are merging, didn't you hear?
Synergies.
7, yes, synergies. They will take, I promise we will not say synergy anymore on the rest of this podcast if we can help it.
No.
7 Boeing 787-9s to compensate for the delayed 777-9 deliveries. I don't know how that's going to work, considering they can't take deliveries of 787s right now, but I trust that they will be able to take deliveries of 787s before 2025, which is when the now thrice delayed 777-9 will be delivered. So this will happen.
Lufthansa says some of these aircraft coming off that they will take delivery of, in some cases in 2023 and 2024, were originally intended for other airlines in 2025 and 2026. So that's pretty interesting right there, that they'll be taking aircraft next year that weren't destined for delivery for several years from now.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see where those aircraft come from, which airlines those aircraft come from, and how Lufthansa puts those aircraft into service. Because as it stands now, if they do take delivery of these aircraft in this compressed timeline, we're looking at a number of, because they also have their initial 787 order on kind of on the burner, ready to go as soon as Boeing can begin deliveries of the 787 again. And so you've got this additional delivery schedule pulling from airlines that were supposed to take delivery in 2025 and 2026. So this is going to be a big chunk of aircraft coming into the airline for all intents and purposes, the same time. So that'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, and that's on top of other aircraft that Lufthansa has acquired from other airlines, like the Philippines A350s that it's just pressed into service just this past week, actually.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how Lufthansa does, how they get spread among the Lufthansa group, and how they introduce those aircraft into the fleet.
Oh, and some A330s, I think, or A350s from Finnair ended up at Lufthansa Group's Eurowings Discover. So the Lufthansa Group's a bit of a mess fleet-wise right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point it's capacity, because airlines, and this goes into the thing we talked about with Republic and airlines parking fleets and letting pilots go and letting crews go and all these things, because nobody really understood at the beginning how things were going to go over the next year, 2 years, 3 years. And so now we've got kind of this wholesale change where airlines are saying, well, we parked these aircraft, we need to bring these aircraft back. Lufthansa this week said, hey, we still have the A380s sitting around. If we have to use them, we will.
A340s.
the phrasing that came out of Lufthansa, it was almost like a threat. It was weird.
If Boeing can't deliver our aircraft when we need them, I swear to God, we will put the A340 back in service. Was pretty much the sound of it.
Don't make me turn this 4-engine plane around.
And then somewhere John Walton was very happy hearing that news.
And that's okay. The other interesting thing is that Lufthansa Cargo will take 7 777-8Fs beginning in 2027. In the bridge years before that, Lufthansa will take 3 777Fs. 2 leased ones will be extended. And this is the interesting bit, and I've had a conversation with a couple people about where this one might be coming from. So they ordered 2 new 777Fs, so direct from Boeing, right from the factory. One of the 3 that Lufthansa is picking up is flying with another airline, quote, will be reassigned to Lufthansa Cargo in the upcoming weeks. So the language parsing, reading between the lines here, is that this is a leased 777F that is going back to the lessor and then being reassigned within the coming weeks. We've had Gavin Werbeloff on the program, our resident numbers expert. His working theory is that this is the airbridge cargo, the singular airbridge cargo 777F that is going to go back to its lessor and then come to Lufthansa. And so I don't know if he's right, but the timing and the opportunity would fit, assuming they can get that plane out of Moscow and anywhere else.
Yeah, that's a big if.
That's a big if. So this is an interesting order because it's another large airline backfilling delayed aircraft orders, and this is what we've seen over and over again because of the aircraft that were parked or stored or discarded during the pandemic or during the early days of the pandemic. And now airlines coming back and going, okay, we've got some delayed programs that we're dealing with. And now we have to start backfilling either with new aircraft orders or finding aircraft that are existing somewhere in the world, looking at Lufthansa and the Philippine A350s, finding those and putting those into service. Kind of along the same vein, Emirates said this week that they expected their 787s to be delayed at least a year, leading to further reliance on their existing fleet and delaying some of the drawdown of their 777 and A380 fleet. So that'll be really interesting to see how Emirates, especially given the size of their wide-body orders writ large, the 787, the 777-9s, all of those, it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out as well.
Yeah, and remember, we just talked about this maybe last week or a couple of weeks ago, but Boeing is ramping up capacity to produce more 777 freighters, the current generation, as a stopgap measure, since they can't get the 777X out. They're reusing that capacity to churn out more 777 freighters. And it seems like Lufthansa jumped at that opportunity to order some additional.
Might as well pick up a couple of them, given how strong the cargo market has been. On the other side, we'll see how strong the cargo market continues to be over the next couple of years to see if that was a decision worth taking. But again, the timelines on these things are so long that you have to, take your decision with the information you have now and then hope that it all works out. Speaking of taking decisions and then hoping it all works out, going back to crew shortages, this is an interesting one from EasyJet. EasyJet and some other airlines are taking out seats in their aircraft so that they can fly with fewer crew. They have staff shortages because of the density of their fleet. They are required to have a fourth cabin crew member. They're A319s. If they take out a row of seats, they can go down to 3 crew members. This is something that is not uncommon. What's interesting to me is that they're taking the seats out rather than just blocking them. I think it was American Airlines used to block, I think, the middle seats on rows 16 and 17 in their 737 800 fleet to stay below that number so that they could operate with 3 crew members. When they densified their aircrafts, they blew past that 150 seat count, and therefore it didn't matter anymore. So those block seats went away. But that was a nice perk while it lasted.
Yeah, and we've seen things like this happen before, but they're typically well orchestrated, well planned out way in advance. Years ago, JetBlue did the opposite of what EasyJet is doing now, where not the opposite, but they didn't just remove the seats, they reconfigured the cabins to actually have fewer seats on the aircraft to do the exact thing here, to have one fewer member of the cabin crew on board, not because of an emergency response to crew shortage, just to reduce costs. So I guess they did the math and figured, yeah, there are fewer passengers, but it's fine because it's fewer crew we have to pay. But in that case, the physical seats were removed, and every other row was granted some fraction of an inch of extra legroom. But in this case, they're just physically removing the seat, and there's just a gap at the back of the aircraft where there's just nothing. No seats.
Yeah.
Just a gap.
I mean, I guess anytime you reduce the weight of the aircraft, you're reducing fuel burn and you're saving money. So it's a dual purpose thing. It's just interesting to me that this is going to be a long enough term solution that they find it worthwhile to actually reduce the number of seats on the aircraft rather than technically reducing the number of seats on the aircraft.
It's good to see, because you introduced the topic by saying taking orders and hoping things work out, which for some airlines leading up to this summer seems to have been the operational mantra. Let's throw things at the wall and hope it all works out for the best. So it's good to see that some airlines are at least responding to it in rather creative ways to get some semblance of operational reliability back. This is a crazy way to have to do it, but it's hopefully it works. Seems like it can't possibly hurt, except for the passengers will have to bump off those flights that now have 3 fewer seats.
6 I think,
fewer
right?
seats. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
a row.
It's a trade-off.
Yeah, it is a trade-off. Let's shift gears and talk about something that should not have happened, but did, and everything happened and everything went well in the end. But this was a bit of a scare in Mexico City. 2 Volaris aircraft were operating at Mexico City. One was on approach, Volaris 799 was on approach, and Volaris 4069 was ready to depart. And the Volaris 799 was cleared to land. Well, 4069 was still on the runway.
Not good.
Not good. Not good at all. The error was caught before anything terrible could happen. 799 went around and safely landed a short time later. Things went as they should once the error was recognized. However, the aircraft came quite close to each other. They were not a safe distance apart, shall we say.
Shades of the Air Canada incident in San Francisco a few years ago, but with much higher resolution video.
Yes. So link to the video in the show notes as requested by everyone. And we'll also put a link to the data in the show notes to show you kind of what we're talking about. Thankfully, everything was okay. Everyone on both aircraft were okay. Both aircraft arrived at their intended destinations safely. But we'll put a link to the video in the show notes, and you can kind of see what we're talking about. And it's iffy.
Yeah, and moving some things around here, but let's continue on the theme of things that happened but probably shouldn't have happened. Where do we go from here?
This is a fascinating one to me, because it's fascinating one. Where credit is due to Virgin Atlantic, because certainly you never want these things to happen, but because Virgin Atlantic's training and certification requirements are above that of the CAA in the UK, they had to turn back because the FO had not yet taken the Virgin Atlantic test to allow them to become operationally ready for their flights. They have a pilot's license. They have all the certifications and qualifications. They are fully trained, et cetera, et cetera. But they hadn't taken a specific test that ensures that the pilots are ready for operational duty. So there was a rostering error because the captain that they were flying with was not trained on evaluating and conducting that test. The rostering error was discovered somewhere over Ireland, and the aircraft turned around and came back. There was a short delay while they found another crew member, and then they were off once again. But a fascinating look at how regimented and specific pilot training is, and how specific and regimented pilot qualifications are. Good on Virgin, I say.
Yeah, definitely not something that should have happened, but really great to see that they would have caught
well
their own
handled.
mistake.
Well handled.
Yeah, well handled, and caught their own mistake and recalled the flight, basically. They very easily could have, and with no ramifications whatsoever, let that flight continue, but they opted not to.
Yeah. Let us move to the end section of the show to talk about wireless things. Well, actually, some wired things, finally.
Yeah.
But we'll get there in a minute. So let's talk about...
This is still in the section of things that shouldn't have happened, but did anyway. We're still in the same section.
Fair enough. Tell me what's going on. Tell me what's going on.
Remember, well, no one knows what's going on. That's the problem.
Okay.
But remember a few months ago when planes were going to drop out of the sky because Verizon and AT&T were turning on C-band 5G?
Yes.
And remember how that didn't really happen, but lots of paperwork prevented flights from operating and all that. And no one really did their homework before they tried to turn it in and graduate. But it turns out that today the FAA had a meeting with some airlines, and we don't have the results of this conversation, but it turns out that they do want to make a push to retrofit and ultimately replace some radio altimeters that could be susceptible to C-band 5G. Again, this is the kind of thing that should have been figured out several years ago, and all the work should have been done before any of this was activated. But things are still very much in limbo at this point. There are, it turns out, some altimeters that could be affected by C-band 5G, seemingly nothing that can't be overcome with some paperwork. But this is still something that's going on. And the current, I guess, the agreement on the network deployment limitations expires, I think, on July 5th. So we could be running up against that deadline and just a couple months from now.
Fantastic.
Again, yeah, and I don't even really understand where we are today, because I was just at JFK, an airport that's supposed to have a C-band 5G buffer around it, and I had great C-band 5G coverage with Verizon all throughout the airport. So that's something. In the terminal, on the airplane, at the gate, on the train, outside of the airport. I do not understand what is going on with C-band in relation to this industry. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good summation of it.
Yeah.
Here's what does make sense. Southwest has finally seen the light.
No. What are they doing?
Yes.
Are they finally going to install Wi-Fi that works?
Yes,
are they finally going to install power? Well, not power outlets, but USB ports?
They're at least going to give you the ability to charge your phone or iPad. I suppose you could charge your computer very, very slowly.
No,
if you have a
these will be
USB-C
60-watt USB-C ports. So
okay, so
charge away.
Your computer will be able to. Yeah, you're ready to go. So Southwest is, and Jason can speak more to the Wi-Fi aspect of it, but the power thing is something that has become kind of a pet peeve of mine
not just
over
you.
the years. Well, certainly not just me. More so people that fly Southwest on a regular basis or fly longer flights on Southwest on a regular basis. Going back years and years and years and years ago, I was at a Southwest Media Days when they introduced the new livery and they were talking about refreshing the cabin. And one of the questions that I had was, okay, what are you going to do to the cabins? They're like, we're going to make it look prettier. I goes, you're not going to do power or anything like that? And they're like, no, we don't need it. Our flights are short. At the time, the argument was people don't have that many devices. People can charge the devices in the airport, and our flights are short enough that when they land, they will have plenty of power to do whatever they want to do. Well, lo, these many years later, that wasn't even remotely anywhere near true anymore. Fine if you're flying from somewhere in California to Vegas or something like that, or intra-Texas, I guess. But anywhere else, I mean, the stage lengths are long enough that you've gotten to the point where if you don't have a fully charged cell phone with an external battery, you're probably going to, if you're using your phone as in-flight entertainment, you're probably going to run up against some battery limitation issues. They apparently finally agree with me and have decided that they're going to begin installing USB-C charging ports in the cabins.
Yeah, to a degree. There's some caveats here.
Caveat me, Jason. Caveat me.
So Southwest, being one of the largest airlines in the world, currently with 734 aircraft, it's only going to be installing these USB ports on the 737 MAX fleet. They begin, I think they said later this fall, they'll go back and install on the MAX 8s they already have and any future deliveries of the MAX, but the nearly 700 NGs they have will not be seeing USB ports, which is a shame because Southwest has actually been a pioneer of in-flight Wi-Fi. They had it very early on, fleet-wide. They had gate-to-gate Wi-Fi, which was great. It has been a long and bumpy road for Wi-Fi on Southwest. Nobody has been particularly happy about the performance, but it's there. And they also have streaming.
Least of all Southwest.
Yeah, at least of all Southwest. Yeah. And they have streaming entertainment for free. And they have live TV, but you can't plug in your phone. And streaming on your own device on a 5-hour flight, you're going to end up with a dead battery at the end. There's no way around that. So it's good to see them finally acknowledge that, but sad to see it limited to the MAX 8, to the MAX family of aircraft only, since that is really almost, I'm not going to say an insignificant portion of the fleet, but at this point, it really actually is.
Yes, at this very moment, it is in 92 out of 600, 92 out of 763 total, 92 versus 666 NGs in the fleet. So it's at this point, it is an insignificant number, but it's a significant change in the posture of the airline and one that I think is long overdue.
Yeah. I mean, even at this point, most mainline European airlines, even some low-cost European airlines have made power or USB or even Wi-Fi available. Even airlines like BA, Air France, KLM, SAS, they've all done this at this point. It's pretty commonplace. So Southwest is really one of the largest holdouts in the world, and I'm sure this will be a much welcomed improvement, but at this point also a very hard to pin down improvement. So it's not something you'll be able to actually count on getting on your aircraft, especially with the amount of swaps they seem to have, where they'll sell you a MAX flight up until the day of, where it suddenly becomes an NG.
The beauty of a consistent fleet.
Yeah, for most of their flights, unless it needs to be ETOPS, it really doesn't matter what you end up on.
This has been quite the episode.
Many synergies were had in this episode.
Oh, wait, I promised we wouldn't say it anymore.
You promised.
Now you've made me a liar. In any case, this has been episode 163 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here, as always, with
Jason Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.